Welcome to the webinar on developing relationships and connecting refugees and friends with Native Nations. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Willem Stoller and I'm a longtime board member of the Friends of the Twaalfe River National Wildlife Refuge Complex, which is located near Portland, an urban refuge. Our two refuges have been building meaningful relationships with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, for example. Members of the Grand Ronde have conducted blessings at our refuges where two traditional Native American staples, camas and wapato, grow. In this webinar, you will hear from 4 Native American panelists who will share their experiences. But first, let me introduce my co-facilitators, Linda Schnee, the National Friends Program Coordinator at Fish and Wildlife, and Natalie Cardet, the Connected Communities Coordinator for the Midwest region, Fish and Wildlife. If you have questions for our panelists, and I do hope that you have plenty, please feel free to enter them in the chat. We will address them after all 4 panelists have shared their stories. And now I'll hand it over to Natalie, who will introduce our panelists. Natalie?
Sorry about that. I'm here.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'm very excited to be here. And our first panelist is Alan Kelley, who will be speaking with us. Then we'll hear from Dr. Taylor Lipscomb. And then we'll also hear from Amy Kaufman, as well as Annie. And Annie, now I'm forgetting your last name right now. Let's see here.
It's Sorrell.
Thank you, Annie. I'm the worst. Sorry about that. And we'll also hear from Annie Sorrell. So I'm very excited for all of you to hear from the panelists, and I'll pass it off to Alan to start us off.
Okay, can everybody hear me and see me?
Can hear you clearly.
Okay. Well, I never knew anything about the Friends group until some things had happened. So, but in this park where we have the Friends group, which is in Missouri, and I used to go there. The first time I went there, I was about 3rd grade. My mother took me there. We had a class party there, and I got to go up to the cliffs, and I met some of the people that worked there. And I was about 8 years old, and I got to walk up to the Bluffs, and the guy that worked there told me that these steps were built by Native Americans. He didn't say which Native Americans, but that's what I was told. I remember seeing that, and it was a pretty good climb to go up there when I was that little. But I made it all the way to the top and looked over the sides, and thought it was really neat. And then after that, my mother told me that she used to go there when she was a kid. She rode her horse there, and which was about a 7-mile ride. So she went there, and her friends rode horses there numerous times. And then when I got my own horse, I rode my horse there once. But and along the way, and then after that, I started riding my bicycle. Before that, I rode my bicycles there. And it was about a 6 to 7 mile journey, I would say, on a bicycle, but it was all flat. And I would go there all the time, and I would also stop by, and me and my brothers would take gunny sacks and pick up bottles along the way, because they were like 2 cents a piece back then. And then they went all the way to a nickel. We thought we was making a lot of money then. And then we'd stop by in Missouri. You could buy fireworks all year round, so we'd stop and spend our money to trade them in for fireworks. But so and then when I was on the reservation, I ran for vice chairman, and I did 3 terms as vice chairman. And we used to donate money to the mission, to the park then. And we would give them $500 donation to do the Eagles show over there. And we also had a truck stop over there, and we'd let people park there at that truck stop at the time. And then we quit giving the donations. We ran into some problems with floods and stuff, and we were pretty much out of business for almost 6 months before we could even do any open back up because the floodwater people couldn't get into our reservation. So, and then so what had happened is I started the TIPO program here at Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and so I was called to come to visit and about the name change that we had to do to change it from what it was to what it is today. So people who didn't want to change that name, and because it was actually more of a racist name, so we didn't want to and it wasn't our idea anyway. It was the National Park Service that decided to change the name. So but most of them did get changed, and all the creeks that were named that, and everything throughout the United States that got changed. So uh, then that's where I met some friends group. I met them there. They were there, helping the park out. Um, and uh, and then I joined the Master Naturalists, and that's where I met a lot more people that from the friends group because they went there all the time also. So then one of them asked me if I would join and become a member of the friends group, and I did that, and still doing it today. Been very busy because I do a lot of compliance work. Um, and I was on other committees also with the Kansas Water Office. I was on Mr. Rick Corps of Engineers. There's a high demand for us right now, and there's a shortage of Indians, so it gets kind of tough, doing all this stuff. But I enjoy it, and I do the best that I can, when I'm doing that. And so we changed the name to Loess Bluffs, and it's in near Mound City, Missouri. Um, and and there's been a lot of work done, and since I was 8 years old over there, it's totally different than what it was when I first saw it. Um, and the Eagle Show is spectacular. So if that's something you've never seen, we had like 4 different types of eagles there last year. This year I couldn't make it because I had other things to do, but I made it. And one time when I was vice chairman, I actually donated the lunch over there, and I had it cooked at the casino, and everybody had fried chicken, and it was a good turnout. So uh, but it's still, a very important place for me, and it's a sacred place. I do know there's burials there from our people, because if we cross the river, we're only about 2 or 3 miles away if you cross the river from where we're at now. And I'm open for any questions that somebody might have, if that's possible or whatever. But that's part of my story.
Great, appreciate that. Yeah, the questions, like indicated before, people can enter them in the chat, and then we'll address them after all panelists have shared their stories. Natalie?
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and pass it off to Taylor.
Hey everyone. Let me see if I can figure out how to share screen here. In the Department of Interior, we use Microsoft Teams, so it's always a little
Different interface.
Yeah. All right. I think that's it. And then I'll go into presenter mode. All right, what are y'all seeing? You see the slides or the
The
We,
presenter mode.
Presenter mode. Okay. I'm trying to figure this out.
you're the guinea pig, Taylor.
All right. I think I can. That didn't- just a second. Okay, sharing screen. I'm going to share the right screen this time.
Looks
Okay.
good.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Sorry about the technical difficulties there. So there's three folks here from the Fish and Wildlife Service today. We all currently work for the service in different capacities. I'm the National Hatchery Operations Coordinator, as well as the Tribal Co-Stewardship Liaison for Fish and Aquatic Conservation. So I'm a different program than Refuges, but I do a lot of the same work that Amy actually does as the National Tribal Co-Stewardship Coordinator. And then Annie, who's going to talk last, is a park ranger at the National Elk Refuge. So I'll dive in. Let's see. So again, I'm Dr. Taylor Lipscomb. I was born and raised on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Western Montana, which is a portion of unceded ancestral homeland of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. I'm Salish and Grovon. It's kind of a coincidence, but actually Amy and Annie are both from the same reservation as me. So we're kind of far flung and in different pieces of the service, but we're all from the same place. So this little town, there's not much of a town there, but I grew up in this little town at the base of these mountains here called St. Ignatius. And both Amy and Annie grew up in Ronan, which is like 10 miles up the road, 15 miles up the road from St. Ignatius. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical context for our current approach to tribal co-stewardship in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and a little bit of a tough history of really failed Indian policy throughout the history of the United States, and some healing and kind of reconciliation that's happened over the past few decades. We're definitely not 100% to a point where it's rectified, but things have gotten better. But it's really important when we're talking to tribes to understand kind of where we came from a federal government perspective. So these are kind of the highlights or lowlights, if you want to call them that, along our trajectory here that I'm going to talk about today. Couple important things to note. It's when you talk to people that maybe are hearing this for the first time, or are not tribal, a lot of people tend to feel guilt or culpability for some of the things that I'm going to talk about, and I'd encourage people to try not to feel that way. I think everybody here on the call today is really coming to this in good faith and wanting to interact with tribes in a meaningful way. And so things that the country's been through to this point aren't your fault, and try not to feel guilty about it, but try to think about what we can do in the future to make things better. Just a little plug for that. So I'm going to start sort of pre-contact, what's often referred to as time immemorial. So most Native American stories describe origination from the land, although modern anthropologists will argue that there was migration of humans to the North American and South American continents over time. So, but Native American peoples, for the most part, believe that they originated from the land here. That's really important. So in kind of academic anthropology, there's a persistent theory, this Clovis first theory. You might be familiar with it. It revolves around this type of point that was found, this arrowhead that there's a picture of there. It has two distinct flutes, kind of technological development that shows up somewhere around 13 to 15,000 years ago. So, and this was widely adopted like in the 60s as the primary way that the Americas were peopled first. And it coincides, that time frame actually coincides with the Beringia land bridge, as well as an ice-free corridor between the Laurentian and Cordilleran ice sheets that allowed people to travel to the North American continent and then subsequently to South America. Here close to our home in Western Montana, there's a Clovis site. It's called the Anzac site on Flathead Creek, and it dates to about 12,000 years before present. And it's actually one of the only Clovis sites that actually have human remains at it. So oftentimes it's just tools and things like that that are found. But the Anzac site has human remains there. So this theory kind of starts to fall apart in recent decades. One of the first things that really put a chink in the armor of it was the finding of this Monteverde site in Chile in 2013. So it was a pretty well-established community that they found. They found fossilized mastodon meat in several huts and evidence that the people had been there for quite a while. And it dated to 12,500 years before present. So this 13,000 years ago, people had just crossed the Beringia land bridge. Probably doesn't line up. And then it further fell apart. Actually, really recently, these footprints, you've probably seen this in the news, were found at the White Sands National Park in New Mexico. And they actually dated to about 23,000 years before present. And I think they're actually young people, so kids that were kind of running around. Some historical context. So if we use this 23,000 years before present as the kind of the best time frame that we have from a science perspective, or the time immemorial origination from the Native American perspective, compare that to, the Great Pyramids of Giza were built in, the pyramids in Giza were built about 4,600 years ago. And then Sumerian agriculture started about 10,000 years ago. So, this really gives some context for how long Native Americans have been here in the same place, persisting with the same resources. So, for some context too, pre-contact, pre-1492, the best estimates are somewhere between 40 and 60 million Native Americans lived on this continent, possibly many, many more. And as many as 95% of those people perished from novel disease that propagated quicker than colonists did shortly after contact with the continent. So I kind of present that all as to provide, this perspective that the knowledge systems and the life ways that Native Americans still practice today, if you think of it in terms of a clock here, have persisted for, as I said, about 23,000 years, best guess, versus the 533 now years post-contact. So we're sort of living in this very small sliver of time relative to this really stable interaction between people and the land and the resources of the land. Yeah, so just keep that in mind as we kind of walk through this. So the first sort of policy, if you want to put it that way, that comes into play here is this doctrine of discovery. So this was a papal bull issued by Pope Alexander VI, who was the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church in 1493, immediately after Columbus landed in the Caribbean islands. And this really provided the justification for the colonization of the Americas. And this quote from that papal bull speaks to that. So it justifies the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. So this seems a little bit abstract in terms of where we're at today and the United States of America, but this was used as the basis for several Supreme Court decisions, but this one in particular in 1823 that stated that after the Revolutionary War, the U.S. acquired the European absolute right to the New World lands that was given by this papal bull. So it still persists as the background of some of the things that we deal with today. And then shortly after that, well, shortly, some maybe 300 years after that, we move into this colonial law period. So this is, predating the Declaration of Independence and the forming of the United States, but really informs a lot of the things that led us to today as well. So the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which was given by King George III, recognized that Native Americans had Aboriginal title to all of the lands that they occupied, and that they had that title until they ceded it through treaty. So this is kind of the basis of the treaties that are still in effect today. And this really made it so that individual colonists couldn't obtain Native American land without being formally part of Great Britain. And then based on this proclamation, 12 of 13 colonies developed laws related to Aboriginal title. And as I mentioned, this forms the basis for the treaties that were entered into between the US and tribes. So that leads us to the period of treaties, removal, and assimilation. This is really 3 periods that are kind of lumped together here, all really damaging in ways to tribes. So the U.S. signed about 368 treaties with different tribes between 1778 and 1871. Many of the treaties were signed under duress or false pretense. They required interpreters. Oftentimes those interpreters, were at the sort of beck and call of the opposition and didn't interpret everything correctly. So some false pretense and duress for sure. And many were broken shortly after ratification. So they were not upheld well on the side of the United States government. Kind of next in our story is the Removal Act of 1830. So this was signed into law by Andrew Jackson, and it made legal the forcible removal of Native Americans from their ancestral homeland to designated Indian territory. And the original kind of focus of this was moving Native Americans from the southeast to west of the Mississippi River to sort of deal with what was often termed the Indian problem. And this is the Cherokee removal to Oklahoma is referred to as the Trail of Tears, and many people are familiar with that terrible story. But there's many, many other examples across the country of removal and really damaging aspects of that. In 1819, so a little bit before, but this sort of echoed through time, so I put it third here. James Monroe signed this Indian Civilization Act, and this started this process of forced assimilation that resulted in 408 Indian boarding schools, and also ultimately the Code of Indian Offenses, which was established in 1883. And this made the practicing of cultural traditions, speaking of language, basically being a Native American in any way illegal. So that leads us to kind of our next pretty damaging aspect, very damaging aspect of Indian policy, and that is the allotment of tribal lands. So in 1887, the General Allotment Act was passed. This is also referred to as the Dawes Act. So this allowed the U.S. to divide reservations into individual allotments and assign those to individual tribal members, which essentially dissolved tribal ownership of unceded lands, and made it so that individuals owned land, which was a pretty foreign concept for most tribes. Also, not all of the land on most reservations was allotted to tribal members. Much of the unallotted lands were actually open to homesteading. So through these two processes, as well as through tribal members, being able to voluntarily sell their allotments, which was, again, something that was pretty foreign to most of these cultures, tribes lost over 100 million acres throughout this process. This Allotment Act also initiated what's called blood quantum laws. So this was a way to designate if somebody is tribal or Native American or not. And this is something that's still in place today and is very damaging to communities, tribal communities. So, it's kind of hard to think about in the context today, how, a little over 100 years ago, what were these people thinking? Why was this the general policy of the day? And there's a few quotes here that really speak to people's mindset. And these are not sort of off the cuff, these are at really official things. So in a report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs by J.D.C. Atkins in 1885, he wrote of allotment, speaking of tribal members: they must abandon tribal relations, give up their superstitions. They must forsake their savage habits and learn the arts of civilization. They must learn to labor, and they must learn to rear their families as white people do, and to know more of their obligations to government and to society. And then James Belford, who was a congressman from Colorado, said, "An idle and thriftless race of savages cannot be permitted to guard the treasure vaults of the nation." And then finally, Teddy Roosevelt, who's revered as one of our sort of heroes of the United States and definitely a hero of the West, wrote in a book in 1889, "The settler and pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages." So we really don't have to guess what people were thinking. They wrote it down, and it's pretty terrible and atrocious, the things that were said around this time. So finally, there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, although not perfect. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 was signed in response to what's called the Miriam Report. The Miriam Report was solicited by Congress to bring to light why reservations were in such bad shape. And it brought the failures of Indian policy to this point really into focus. So the act ended allotment and allowed for repatriation of lost lands. It also allowed for self-governance through the formation of tribal constitutions, which ultimately supported tribal sovereignty, which was the original, sort of, I wouldn't say intent, but the result of signing treaties with these sovereign nations. So we finally sort of acknowledge that and support sovereignty with the Reorganization Act. So even though this act was signed, less than 10% of the lands that were lost were restored following reorganization. And as things go, the pendulum kind of swung the other way in 1953 through termination. So the House Concurrent Resolution 108 ended federal recognition for several terminated tribes. There were 60 separate terminations that resulted in about 3 million acres of tribal lands being lost. Also, along with this termination idea was the relocation policy that aimed to assimilate and urbanize Native Americans. So essentially move them from their ancestral homelands to cities. There's this flyer here that kind of speaks to that. So come to Denver, the chance of a lifetime, and talking about how you can urbanize and be an asset to society. So this era was followed by a shift to self-determination, which I'm going to talk about here in a second before I pass it off to Amy. But really the damage from these eras preceding and specifically termination were irreparable for some tribes. So we still haven't rectified some of these atrocities. So moving on to tribal self-determination, which is the Indian policy that we're under right now. So the Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 really upheld tribal sovereignty through granting tribal control of federally funded programs, specifically those in the BIA for the most part, and also through tribal contracting. So the federal government could contract with tribes for the tribes to be able to provide services for themselves, essentially recognizing that tribes know what they need best, and they're best suited to serve those things. So this placed an emphasis on self-governance and tribal sovereignty again. And this, in many ways, was a direct result of American Indian activism. So you've probably heard of the American Indian movement, Wounded Knee 2, the occupation of Alcatraz. All of these things were happening sort of concurrently with other civil rights movements. But many of these things would basically tribes took matters into their own hands and forced the government's hand to change course. So self-determination ended the termination era. So that's still sort of the era that we're in today is self-determination, and we've moved recently towards what we're terming co-stewardship under this last administration. So the Joe Biden under the last administration issued an executive order reforming federal funding and support for tribal nations to better embrace our trust responsibilities and promote the next era of tribal self-determination, which really reasserted that self-determination is the best policy to date that we have. This was followed by a joint secretarial, actually, I think the joint secretarial order happened just before that. So somewhere right around the same time between the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of the Interior on the fulfilling the tribal trust responsibilities to Indian tribes and the stewardship of federal lands and waters. So those are sort of the high level policies of the day, and a little bit lower level policies. So at the DOI level, the Department of Interior level, we have a few policies, but the most recent is this 301 DM7, which is the departmental responsibilities for consideration and inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in departmental actions and scientific research, that compels DOI agencies to elevate Indigenous knowledge systems to be on par with Western science when we talk about making decisions. And then also the Fish and Wildlife Service policy, which is that 510 there. And this provides a framework for government-to-government relationships, which furthers the United States and the Department of the Interior's trust responsibility to federally recognized tribes to protect, conserve, and use tribal reserved, treaty guaranteed, and statutorily identified resources. So a lot of verbose things there, but essentially this is how tribal self-determination is brought sort of to the ground through the Department of Interior and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so for some really specific examples of that, Amy Kaufman and Annie Sorrell are going to talk more about that. First with Amy talking specifically about the refuge system and how some of these policies land. So I can kick it to you, Amy. what should I should probably stop sharing, huh, Natalie? And then she can share.
Yeah,
Whatever you two prefer.
yeah, I can go ahead and try to figure out how to share this. So can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Can
Yes.
hear you and
Okay,
can
cool.
see
I
you.
was seeing head nods, but okay, great. All right, I'm gonna share my screen. Thank you, Taylor. That was wonderful. I always love to hear you speak. I always learn something. Oh, that doesn't look like it's right, is it? That's
Yeah,
my,
you're not in presentation mode. Yeah.
okay, so I have to get in presentation mode.
Yeah, I think if you go down the bottom right, there's like that little, it looks like a slideshow, like a projector.
Okay. Hmm. Okay, I'm gonna stop share. I'm gonna go to the slideshow projector. Oh, there we go.
I swear we're a lot better at this in Teams.
We're like, yeah, really stuck on Teams. Okay, so I see the slide, the projector. Sorry. Did I go to video settings? What'd you do, Taylor?
Oh, I don't remember.
Amy,
Um,
you can do what you did before of just share the screen, but at the
Okay.
top of the bar, when you said it, you'll see presentation and just click on
Uh-huh.
that. So if you share it again,
Sure.
yeah, and the issue
then-
that I have two screens and it kicked the presentation over to
Okay.
being shared, so that might happen.
okay.
Okay, so
So
what I'm
now
gonna
now look for slideshow, slightly above your slide, and
Okay.
click on that.
Okay,
Double click.
on slideshow.
Yeah, no, go. I'm sorry. From the beginning, way over on the left.
I'd go from current.
Oh, I'll go to Taylor's. So I have to start where I'm at here. Should I just do present in Teams?
From
Is that-
beginning.
From
From
current.
current slide.
From current slide.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you guys. And I apologize. I probably should have figured this out prior. Oops, I actually want to go back. Just a second. Move this out of the way. I'm gonna go back. Okay, so my name is Amy Langford Kaufman. I'm going to just follow up Taylor. Taylor's a great speaker, so it's always a little bit intimidating to speak after him. But my name is Amy Langford Kaufman. I am located up in the northwest part of Montana. I do live about 10 minutes apart from Taylor. We both grew up here as well as Annie. We're all from the same area. Taylor's in a national headquarters position for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as am I. I work for the Refuge system, and I sit under the Division of Natural Resource Conservation Planning, but I'm generally oversaw by the Chief of Refuges. And so I speak with them often, weekly on refuge issues in regards to tribal issues and anything going on with refuges that involve bison, involve tribally led projects, issues, anything involving self-governance tribes, tribal treaties, anything like that is my game. So I'll just call this part of my presentation, Empowering Collaboration and Co-Stewardship with Native American Nations within the National Wildlife Refuge System. So I always like to start just with the introduction of myself. I'll go deeper into an introduction in the next slide, but that's my information right there if anybody wants to grab it. One thing I know about refuges and being tribal myself is that the refuge system mission is very similar to tribal beliefs and reciprocity and needs for continuing the work that we do with others into the future. So I just put this quote in there. It definitely is something that like my heart, we developed this quote in our chartered co-stewardship group for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuge system. And so I know you all can read that. I won't read it to you, but That's where we're at. That's where we're at. I mean, the refuge system has a really unique responsibility to work with Indigenous peoples to protect land, culture for future generations. So, oops, and I totally blocked myself out. So a little history about myself is I have 16 years of refuge management. I was a regional type tribal liaison for Region 6 for about a year and a half, where I did cross programmatic work, but I'm a refuge person at heart. I also did a BIA stint as a superintendent on the Flathead Agency, where I learned a lot about BIA, self-governance, 638, compacted tribes. It was a really good experience for me. I'm a mom to 3 adult kids, which is fun, pretty new to me. And I have 5 young dogs. I don't know how that happened. I'm Salish, I'm Bitterroot Salish, and I'm also Ani Grovant, as is Taylor. So me and Taylor have a lot of similarities. Grew up in the same place, definitely from the same tribes. But yeah, it's really, really interesting that we both are headquarters positions. So as my time as a refuge manager, I cut my teeth at the National Bison Range. That's where I started. I worked at Lee Metcalf National Wildlife Refuge. That's a homeland for the Bitterroot Salish people. So it was a very important place for me to work. I worked at Benton Lake National Wildlife Refuge and the associated wetland management district on the Rocky Mountain front. I worked in Kansas as a refuge manager at Mare de Seine National Wildlife Refuge in Southeast Kansas, which is bottomland hardwood forest. You can see there, I'm in a really interesting area. I worked at Tamarack for a while in northern Minnesota, which was a great experience as well too. I worked in Nebraska in the Rainwater Basin. I've worked with many different friends groups. Every place that I've gone to and worked at, I definitely, didn't have as much action as I did to is moving home, but I loved every place that I worked at. And my first thought when I'd get there as a refuge manager was like, what happened before this was a refuge? Who was here? What was the tribal history of this area? And, this must have been a nice place to live. This had to have been a wintering ground, or this had to have been this had to have been that. I always thought that way. I was a little bit different. I thought differently about the animals, especially owls. Those are a unique, they have a different cultural value to my tribes as they do to maybe someone else. And so it was really interesting working as a refuge manager for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But right now I'm in headquarters, working for the National Wildlife Refuge System, and it is pretty interesting. We're about to go through, excuse me, going through an administrative change right now, which I think is going to be interesting. It's about my 5th stint in doing an administration change. So we'll see what happens in this next one. So I want to go back to myself, and everything I'm saying is just like what I know about who I am. I'm not trying to put any blame on anybody else or make anybody uncomfortable, but this is my story and where I come from. So I always put in here, I say I'm Bitterroot Salish. This is the homeland of that is located right in the area where Lee Metcalf was, Lee Metcalf National Wildlife Refuge. And I always put the creation story of the Bitterroot in here because that is our creation story for our tribe. And the Bitterroot are still around there today. The valley's named after the Bitterroot. Bitterroot grows on Lee Metcalf National Wildlife Refuge. It's definitely something that the tribe harvests every year. The month of May is named after the Bitterroot flower. This is just interpretive information that, I don't, I don't know if it's shared at any of the refuges or the refuge in the Bitterroot Valley, but the Bitterroot flower is part of our creation story. It was gifted by a spirit bird that saved the people from starvation. So that's very important for us. And I just like to highlight that. So I don't know if anybody on this call is familiar with Lee Metcalf. I worked with the Friends group there. Okay, so they had a really active Friends group when I was there. So Lee Metcalf National Wildlife Refuge is a small 3,000 acre refuge in the middle of the Bitterroot Valley. To Salish people, it's called meandering waters, where the water used to just meander through. It's changed quite a bit since then. It's been channelized. There's some water rights issues there. It's a little bit different, but it is a homeland. And it has a lot of cultural value because a lot of our ancestors are still there, buried there. And they were there for thousands of years. So this represents the Treaty of Hellgate. This is the treaty that moved the Bitterroot Salish off of the Bitterroot area. But what was granted to the tribe was that they could stay in this area as long as they weren't issues. And they could stay there and coexist with the settlers that were coming into the area. But then they realized that this land was really, really fertile in the Bitterroot Valley. So they ratified this treaty in 1859 and and made the Bitterroot Salish march north to the Flathead Reservation. They were marched at gunpoint and they were moved relatively quickly to that area. But at the same time, there was also boarding schools that were, which Taylor alluded to. There were boarding school happening. There were kids being taken from parents. There was assimilation happening. It was really a hard time for tribal people. So the Bitterroot Salish were put on the Flathead Reservation in 1859, along with the Kelley people and the Kasonka people. And so there was 3 different tribes put under one reservation. And so I just give a little history of my work in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I've worked with the service for almost 20 years now. And I never thought that I would be in this day and age where we had such of a powerful administration that focused on tribal relations, on Native American policy, on fulfilling our trust responsibilities to tribes. I really am happy to be, in this space right now. I was able to meet with Deb Holland, several times within her run as Secretary of Interior, which I feel really thankful about. And I could have talked more about it, but I was the bison range manager when we transferred the bison range to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, which was a kind of an unknown thing to do. But it was hard, but it was the right thing to do. And it was passed along to the tribe through the Water Rights Act, signed off on the omnibus bill at the last administration and last days of the Trump administration. So that refuge was transferred to BIA to hold in trust for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. So that worked out well. The tribes are doing very, very good with it. Moving into this new administration, there were a ton of director's orders and secretarial orders, which Taylor alluded to, Secretarial Order 3403, Secretarial Order 3404, which was fulfilling our trust to tribal nations. And so we started talking a lot about co-stewardship and co-management. And so I like to just make sure when I'm speaking, and I'm sorry, I have a frog in my throat, when I'm speaking to people, that you understand the differences between co-stewardship and co-management. So co-stewardship is really it's a collaborative agreement. It's like more of a shared interest. There are MOUs, MOAs that are written. They're agreements that are, friendly agreements. And they're for the well-being of everybody. That's really where you want to be in co-stewardship. And I feel that co-stewardship agreements that refuge managers have with tribes are definitely really successful right now, because it allows us to share resources. It allows us to have a longer term history on the lands that we manage. We don't have this anecdotal information. We have thousands of years of indigenous knowledge that is being melded into our Western science. And so we just have really successful programs going on within the service in which tribes are a big part of. Co-management is a step further, where your co-stewardship activities are undertaken under official agreements, federal authority. And so it's a legal obligation to do this work in the form of a 638 contract, in a form of an annual funding agreement. They're quite different. They're definitely, they come with MOUs, they come with all of that, but they come with huge funding, like funding sources that you filter through Bureau of Indian Affairs, from Fish and Wildlife Service under a 638 agreement. And so self-governance tribes are the tribes that you'll be working through for co-management. There's a lot of work to be done there. So it's not something you just learn in one presentation, but I'm just putting the surface level information out there. So as the bison range manager, I was also the manager of Nine Pipe National Wildlife Refuge, Pablo National Wildlife Refuge as well, and Lost Trail National Wildlife Refuge. But Nine Pipe and Pablo are really interesting. So they are on the Flathead Reservation. They are easement refuges. So these are National Wildlife Refuges that were essentially tribal lands that the tribe asked for a federal easement to go over it. And then we are the official managers of the land as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We don't manage the water that's in the middle. That's part of the tribe, essentially. So we don't deal with the water. We deal with the land on the outside and make sure that we put our federal authority on that we have for extra protections for migratory birds. So Nine Pipe has been around for quite a while. It was actually developed in the 40s. And I developed, as a manager, I went forward and made these signs at Nine Pipe and Pablo that have 3 languages on them. So it has English, and then I put Salish Kalispé language on one side of the signs, and then I put the Kasanka language on the other side, so signs that face north on all of our signs. So they were trilingual signs that happened. These were not really super easy to get through at all. I think it took between us, tribal council, solicitors, cultural committees, and our sign program and funding. It took us about 1.5 years to get these signs done and made. So there was a lot of processes to this happening, and it wasn't quick, and there was a lot of kickback and, this and that. And then there was also my staff being able to like break away from spring activities with the bison herd to go put signs in. And so, but they were huge. Like these were really, really impactful, because there is millions of people that drive up and down the highway where these refuges are located, and people would see them and it would start kind of making waves, and people are asking questions about the culture of the area. There was recognition that it is on a reservation, that these lands do have co-management. So it was really interesting. And so one thing I just say and do often is the most important thing about working with tribes is, having a relationship with them. The easy thing for me, coming back and doing the bison range, is that I'm from that area. And a lot of my family are tribal. And so even on council, on the tribal council, it was easy for me to communicate with those folks. They already had trust in me. What I did was I made room at the table for everybody. There hadn't been really a seat for the cultural committee to come in and speak. There hadn't been space and time made for all the connections that needed to be made that were culturally needed for the decisions that we were making. I think anywhere you go, just knowing the land's history, that includes the treaties, That includes some of the acquisitions that occurred there. I mean, if you're a friends group, you're a volunteer, I think you should know these things just because it makes you have some information in your back pocket, and it gives you a space to start a conversation with local people there. It's good to know who the ancestral inhabitants were. When you're developing interpretation materials, and I know Friends Group, they often, fund the funds to do this, but or get funding to do it. Visitor centers, interpretation materials are really good when you let your Indigenous partners lead the effort, give them the time and space to do it. Like I said, co-stewardship is wonderful because it includes this two-eyed seeing. You're merging Indigenous science with Western science. It allows you to be really creative. And it also is really, really meaningful to tribal people when you do that. So these are some of my examples. There's tons of different examples happening all over the US. Alaska has some really, really serious Indigenous knowledge going on there. They have refuge information technicians who are local people from the villages who run the visitor centers, interpretation centers. They teach all the classes. They help with the management of the land in that way. They're putting information out there so people care for the land differently. In the Pacific Islands and Native Hawaiian communities, they're teaching language that's appropriate to the islands, to the animals, and to just in discussion what's appropriate, because you don't want to be offensive. Like nobody does. And I go down there, I don't understand some of the words or what do they mean. And so, I'm really enjoying learning more about those, and they're taking a good step to do so. So I just put this up there because this is some of the work that I've done in the past. So this is some funding sources that went out to do some elk research in Wyoming with the Wind River tribe. In these pictures, this is actually my friends at the bison range, and this is them in the old visitor center next to our tribal display that we had. And we became really close, good friends, but they're also like my mentors, and I've been my friends forever. We grew up together. But they took the Bison Range Visitor Center and turned it into a very wonderful cultural center. It's beautiful. This is Big Medicine. He lived on the Bison Range he lived to be like 28 years old. He was pretty old, 28 or 32, old bison, but he was hope. He was a sign of hope for the tribe. He was a white bison. He had a black top knot. This is the medicine tree down in the Bitterroot Valley where our tribes still go to pray. And I put that on there because we really have, a connection to that area. And so I always think about that. And Lee Metcalf was incredibly important for me to work there because I felt spiritually connected to the area. Also because it was our homeland. So I thought very differently about it, how powerful it was. And I think we can reflect that in our interpretation in a way where it affects everybody, because it's important to everybody, not just tribal people, but everybody to know the history. So I'll go ahead and move forward. Oh, there's the Bitterroot. And that was actually taken, excuse me, at the Bison Range. That's Bitterroot flower. Okay, and so I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Annie Sorrell. She's the National Elk Refuge Visitor Center Manager and Volunteer Coordinator. And I'll go ahead and just stop sharing and let you share, Annie.
All right, let's see if I can figure this out. Well, it's loading on my end, so just give it 1 second. Oh. Well, sorry, I live in really rural Wyoming, so sometimes my internet is not great. Can people see the screen at least?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. I may need Amy to. Well, I'll go to this one in hopes that it will catch up. Oh, it won't even do that one. Okay. Um,
Do you want me to move your screen for you?
okay, there you go. Can everybody see
You got
that?
it?
Oh,
You enlarge that?
Yep.
It's clear.
okay.
Looks good, Annie.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so my name is Annie Sorrell. I am part of the branch of visitor experience and community engagement. This used to be visitor services within the National Wildlife Refuge System. Yeah, like Amy and Taylor have mentioned, I was born and raised in Ronan, Montana on the Flathead Reservation. I am Bitterroot Salish and Nez Perce. I have been in Fish and Wildlife since 2019. I started as an intern at the National Bison Range. And this is what my photo is. It's of me and my dad. A very proud moment of mine. As Amy was mentioning, it's the transition of the National Bison Range into the hands of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Truly a wonderful experience that I am so blessed to be a part of. My dad is part of the Mission Valley Honor Guard there. He was a Vietnam vet. And nothing makes me more happier than spending time with my family. I graduated from Haskell Indian Nations University in 2015 with a undergrad in environmental science, where I focused on water quality, not necessarily anything to do with visitors. I then went to school at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where I worked with Robin Wall Kimmerer. The work that I did with her in the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment there at SUNY really kind of changed my outlook about how I want to engage with the public when it comes to Indigenous perspectives, and in particular, two-eyed seeing. And so within the branch, it's pretty confusing. As friends groups, you probably already work with visitor services in any certain capacity. So within we have three pretty much central services that we focus on. And so for center focused for customers, it's really making sure that there's a high level of satisfaction when you come to operating visitor centers, when you're designing, installing, maintaining trails, if you're going to construct viewing blinds, if you're issuing special use permits, if you're working with private concessionaires, working with friends groups, and improving facilities with rec fees. The next service that we do is really focus on wildlife-driven opportunities. And so what that means is that the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act identified that we have 6 main priority recreational uses that our branch focuses on. And that is going to be hunting, fishing, wildlife observation and photography, environmental education, and recreation. And lastly, our last service, which is my favorite fact, and if you guys don't know this, I hope you tell everybody within Fish and Wildlife or anybody that you work with, is that there is at least one National Wildlife Refuge in every state and territory that is within an hour's drive of any major city. That is really important because I think as people that live in large cities, they do lack the connection to nature, but if within an hour drive, they can find that by any National Wildlife Refuge within an hour, which is a very cool thing. Please highlight it to most people. When I started my upper education, I was very into hard science. And when I went to the National Bison Range as an ACE intern for visitor service manager there, I didn't quite know where to start. And so working in an aspect of water quality, really hard science, and then moving more into community work. This is kind of based from the Nature Conservancy that does a lot of work, not only with local tribes here in America, but also internationally. They work with a lot of Indigenous peoples. So this was kind of the main guiding point within the first few years of me learning and working with communities, mainly Indigenous communities, but all of these can be used with whatever community you work with. Indigenous communities, other people of color, minority communities, anywhere these can be applicable to. And the one that I always like to highlight first is a Indigenous-led, community-led ideas. As Amy had mentioned, allowing people to have a seat at the table and being able to tell their own stories is really important when it comes to understanding the true history of the area where you are located. The next one is going to be recognizing inclusivity when it comes with your community, and also respecting the diversity of Indigenous peoples. As Taylor and Amy have mentioned, there is a lot of generational communities that have been removed from the areas, and it is up to you at any place that you go to understand and learn what your Indigenous community or what your community is. Fun fact, there's over 500 national wildlife refuges. Another fun fact, there's over 500 federally recognized tribes. So that means there is a lot of potential to connect with lots and lots of different communities within any aspect that you want to move forward in with Fish and Wildlife. Next, you're going to want to work on reciprocity. While you're building these relationships, it is a wonderful opportunity for mutual learning and sharing of information and knowledge. But you have to make sure that it is transformational and not transactional. You want to make sure that when you are learning from these people of any type of your community, that you are also providing them with something that you can provide. You want to make sure that you are transforming an idea and not making sure that you are just getting something from them and not doing something in return. The next one is after talking with a few tribal members in certain areas and a few people from Fish and Wildlife. It's to make sure that they have open and clear lines of communication. I think Taylor did a great point of pointing out how some of these communities may harbor some negative intentions and negative repercussions from Fish and Wildlife staff. And so with that, we have to hold ourselves accountable, not only for what has happened in the past, but to make sure that we are moving forward with clear lines of communications that build long-term partnerships, and we are committed to those partnerships for a long time. These are not 5 to 15 years that we are looking for. This is part of our mission of Fish and Wildlife, that we're going to continue this for the bettering of the future of the public, but also for the future of Indigenous peoples and our communities within these refuges. Lastly, it's to be patient. I think you guys have all learned how there could be a time when maybe tribes don't want to work with you. It's going to take a while to build these relationships. It's going to be scary on both sides. Reaching out for the first time to a tribal nation is a scary thing. I was lucky enough to be at the National Bison Range where I knew the community. I knew who I wanted to work with, but coming here to the National Elk Refuge, I have learned a lot about how it could be a scary process of reaching out for that first time. But then when you reach out, you have to make sure that you allow them the space and the time to respond to how they want to respond. You have to make sure that you understand what that community role is and what do they want that role to be. It is not our job for Fish and Wildlife employees or NGOs or friends group to determine what that community role is. Our end goal is to always co-create plans that align with the community priorities and that also co-align with Fish and Wildlife missions and priorities. If you use these 5, I will guarantee there are some fun things that get to happen from there. I get to talk about some fun examples. Again, these are just 2 examples that I have been a part of and that I know. In our staff here, we have 3 people that are within our visitor engagement and community engagement branch. And our refuge team calls us the Thoughts and Feelings group. And I fully agree with that. We are very much thoughts and feelings. And so these are some of the 2 examples that really made me happy to be a part of or witness as a Fish and Wildlife employee and also as a tribal member. The first one I want to highlight is selfishly, it's from my visitor center here. It is a wonderful Indigenous art mural that we were able to work with the town of Jackson, in particular with the Jackson Hole Public Arts. And so with their, they wanted to work on this idea of land signals. And within land signals, there was 3 different art murals that went up around Jackson that wanted to envision a future that more authentically includes Indigenous voices and traditional ecological knowledge that makes us better stewards for natural resources and cultural heritage, in particularly around the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Our artist in the photo, his name was Ben Pease, and he created this art mural called Reimagining Connections. And it really invites our visitors to rethink the understanding of wilderness. For a little context, it was the 40th of the anniversary of the Wilderness Act for Wyoming, and also the 60th for the National Wilderness Act. And within that Wilderness Act, it really much focuses on how it's untouched, and that is absolutely not true. So this mural is rather than viewing it as untouched, isolated place, we want to celebrate it as a living, evolving space that is deeply intertwined with the human history and culture. There are many traditional definitions, wildlife and conservation being 2 of them, that very much often overlook the profound relationships that Indigenous peoples have had since time immemorial, as Taylor had mentioned. After the releasing of the mural, there was a panel that I was able to attend at the Center for the Arts here in Jackson, Wyoming, where it was truly spectacular to see 4 artists. One was the speaker, and to hear how they put art into conservation was spectacular. As a non-artist myself, it is really refreshing to see that you can do conservation in different aspects that are created by your community. And so Ben Pease did this quote that has stuck with me since it happened. I may have cried a little bit when he was at the panel as well. And so it says, deciding to enter into agreement in a relationship with Native peoples to most effectively move into the future, to make space for everybody and all life, not just human. I think it's a good thing. I do know that artists are windows to the world. We've created for all human history to tell others our experience or maybe our connection. I think that artists bring ideas, and those ideas bring people, and then people bring change. I feel like in thinking about what stewardship means, it's all of these factors put together so that we can create a place for all life. And I think moving forward, that's what we should all do. As an ecosystem, we already take abiotic and biotic processes, living and non-living things, to make sure that we create a place for everybody and all life. The next example I want to talk about is Desert National Wildlife Refuge Complex. Now, if you've never been to Desert, which is a little bit outside of Vegas, in 2013, they started building the Desert National Wildlife Visitor Center. And then through that, they changed Ash Meadows Visitor Center and then Paranagit Visitor Center. Within every visitor center, they had more and more Indigenous knowledge through their creation of their visitor center, where Paranagit was the end goal, where their tribes worked with them from the start to the end. And it is truly spectacular to see, when you include communities in the beginning, what the end product could be. Part of Desert National Wildlife Complex, so they have Desert National Wildlife Refuge, they have Ash Meadows, they have Moapa, and then they also have Paranagit National Wildlife Refuge. Within those systems, they work with 2 affiliated tribes, the Nui, which is the Western Shoshone. Then they also worked with the Nui Wovi, which is Southern Paiute. And it's very, very cool. If you ever get the chance, go to all the visitor centers and see how they have changed throughout the creation of the visitor centers. This is a great example of when you're talking about interpretation about what does the community actually want to talk about. On the left-hand side is from Desert National Wildlife Refuge, where the involvement of Indigenous people was a minimum. You can kind of see that it is a traditional sign, talks about who the people are, where were they located, where are the ancestral lands. Now, on the right-hand side is an example from Paranagit of what their interpretation looks like if you can include your community from the beginning. You have a message from what they want. They want you to know that where water is precious, and that's going to be in the Paranagit Valley. Not only do you get to hear their story through them, you get to also know the language, and you get to see how it is spelled out, which is very important in traditional communities. Most of the time, their language dictates where a certain location is. Their words are very, very entwined with the ecosystems. Then this one is when you're looking at a visitor experience, what is missing? I really, really enjoy this slide. On the right is desert. It's on their trail. It's a beautiful trail, very fun to see. But as you can tell, there is very minimal when it comes to indigenous perspectives. On the left-hand side, the very first word that pops out to me is the Nuuvi word for mallard. It's something small that can change how people feel while looking at interpretation. And this comes from working and having that spot at the table for those community members to be at. This one right here is a photo of the trail that is located at Paranagit. There is a red trail the entire way. There are some parts where it kind of expands into a larger area, but the red trail is determined by the red-tailed hawk that they have there, which is really important to their people. And you're supposed to follow that around. And throughout there is multiple areas that have different words for the Nuuvi people, as well as, I think it's like fish species. So desert has a lot of endemic fish species. So just if we can always remember that a small changes by working with the community can make the difference on who feels welcomed on refuge lands. And I just want to remember to highlight kind of everything that everybody has talked about, that relationships, knowledge sharing, and co-stewardship with federally recognized tribes, Alaska Native corporations, Alaska Native organizations, and the Native Hawaiian communities are essential to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service mission. We have the direction, we have the tools available to ensure that these collaborative interactions between the service and these communities are in the betterment of the shared interest of the conservation of fish, wildlife, and their habitats, as well as the protection and use of cultural, trust, and treaty resources that exist on service lands. When the service and Indigenous people work together on managing our lands and waters, along with the fish and wildlife that inhabit them, our long-standing relationships are not only strengthened, but our resources are better protected. I just want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to us, and I think there's enough time for questions, I hope.
Yes, there should still be some time left for questions. And I must say, wow, I'm very impressed with these 4 presentations. And thank you very much. But anyone who has a question, please, Natalie, did you find any in the chat?
Yeah, no, I didn't find any in the chat, but if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, we can take questions from you all if you want to introduce yourself too, and let us know where you're from before you ask the question. Thank you so much to all 4 panelists. Yes, Desiree, am I saying it correct?
Yes, yes. Hello. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone. Desiree Sorensen Groves. I'm the president and CEO of the National Wildlife Refuge Association. Thank you so much for doing this. I think you guys rocked it. This was a great presentation. But my question was, if you could give us some examples of co-management examples around the country that are happening. You know, I know of some, but I'm sure I don't know of that, all of them. So I was just curious if you guys could give some examples. So anyone from the panel, that would be great. Thank you.
I can do that. So I actually have a good list here that I just want to go through. Here it is. And these are management. So these are, official agreements with funding associated with them through self-governance. And so, let's see. So there is one with science applications, somewhat associated with the refuges, but it's a Region 9, and there is technical assistance to members from tribes and individuals with an emphasis on climate adaptability, biodiversity, and wildlife disease and wildlife corridors connectivity. Region 7, Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge. Excuse me, sorry. So this is through the Council of Athabascan Tribal Governments. They're providing for support Department of Indigenous Sentinels Network, Tanana Chiefs Conference and Northwest Boreal Partnership. They are going to be doing monitoring efforts together on the Yukon Flats area, Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge. This is heavy to Alaska, a lot of these. They have a pretty good 638 contract in place already. So this funding at Kodiak will be hiring a community affairs liaison, and that person will be, they'll be hired through the community. They'll be from the Kodiak Archipelago region, and it will benefit the refuge and Alaska Native stakeholders. And they'll be informing folks about the deep cultural and historical ties through Kodiak Archipelago region and in their unique position to meaningfully contribute to and enhance communications between refuges and other Alaska Native tribes within the region. And then, let's see, Region 7, ARD, External Affairs, that person's going to be hired directly from the Council of Athabascan Tribal Governments to be an ARD within the Office of Communications, which I think is great. Let's see. What else do we have? Boy, there's a lot in Alaska. They're doing a good job. So that's just a few examples that I have right here. So then we also have one in Region 8, which is the Pacific Northwest region. It's Dungeness and Protection Island National Wildlife Refuge with the Jamestown Squalum Tribe. So the Jamestown Squalum Tribe is going to receive funding to cover administrative functions associated with the tribe, carrying out the purposes and goals and objectives laid out in the Dungeness National Wildlife Refuge System and Protection Island CCP plan. And they're going to be having an annual funding agreement associated with that, and it will be co-management with the Jamestown Squalum Tribe and Dungeness. And so that's been pretty successful so far. It was a work in progress for a very long time. So they're planning to move that into the future and be the tribe would like to, and the refuge would like the Jamestown Squalum Tribe to be a part of management moving into the future. So those are just a few examples. I can think of some other ones offhand, but there was and I don't want to take all the time, I apologize. But you have some East Coast co-management agreements in place, and Rappahannock is one of them with Rappahannock tribes, Rappahannock National Wildlife Refuge, where they transferred that building to the Rappahannock tribe. They're looking at other areas just to make it more contiguous area of land where it would be co-managed with the tribes and the refuge system. It's a benefit to the refuge and the tribes because it releases some resources that Fish and Wildlife was having to put towards these areas, and the tribes can provide those, fill in those holes and gaps. And so there's quite a few examples. There's quite a few examples from tribes and bison stewardship. So there's a big bison stewardship action plan that's going on, and that's tribally led right now. And that will eventually come with funding in some way or another, depending on which way the administration goes and how much power it gets to do that. So I'll just stop there. And hi, Desiree. We've met before. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Amy.
Yep, I'll leave it at that.
And we have some questions in the chat, and wondering if
Yep, the Rappahannock. Do you like I bought this for $54 at a Rappahannock Native American powwow. Isn't that nice?
Love it. Love it.
So there is a question here in the chat and wondering if any of you want to respond, but who would be, you know, based on your experience, who would be best for friends groups to reach out to in terms of reaching out to tribal community members or tribal government staff to start building relationships?
Annie, did you want to take that one? That might be
I was
a
going to
good one for
suggest
you.
Annie. So
Yeah,
basically, where do you start? Who should you first reach out to?
I mean, I can take it. So I know I work a little bit with our friends group here. I always love being the one that can give the initial reach out. We can always get you in touch with our tribal liaisons. I feel like they are always going to be great starter points. But again, if you look anywhere within your area and you can find the tribe that you're working with, if it's a tribe, I just reach out to their education committee, or if I need language, I will reach out to their TIPO offices that was mentioned earlier. Tribal historic preservation offices are truly wonderful. And I will say, reach out to your refuge staff and see if they can get you in touch with people through Fish and Wildlife. I know that each region has their own tribal liaison, or if you reach out to the tribe themselves, you can start building that relationship as a friends group or a nonprofit as well. That's where I would start.
Thank you, Annie. And yeah, and I know Linda just posted this in the chat, but any questions that aren't addressed, we'll be sure to send them to the panelists and try to answer any questions for you after this wraps up, because I know we won't be able to get to everyone's question. And another question too, before time is up, that I wanted to ask for the panel: how do you balance opportunities to highlight Indigenous communities and ancestral peoples with the need to make refuges pertinent to other underserved communities? For example, a nearby Hispanic community. So how do you balance those responsibilities? What would you suggest for friends groups?
Well, I know it's probably not the answer that people want to hear, but you have to reach out to everybody. Everybody deserves a seat at that table. You can't pick and choose whose information you would like to have there. As somebody who lives in Jackson, Wyoming, where we have outside of Martha's Vineyard, the richest county in the country, we don't have a lot of our minority communities that live within Jackson. Some of them make an hour trip into here. So what do? We spend a lot of time at community events. We participate in community events. We have Hispanic-led interpretation if we can. Again, your goal is to make sure that that community is the one that's speaking for their story. I know that it's a little bit tough when you're trying to have lots of different communities in one area. We have a huge visa program here, so we have a lot of Eastern European as well that don't necessarily understand public lands. But your goal is to make sure that all of them have a voice within your project, your location. I know it's really tough to do. One way that you can do it is making sure if Hispanics is your one, you have bilanguage on all of your interpretation, on your panels. You can come here to Jackson, Wyoming, and half of our panel is in Spanish because we have a huge Hispanic population that's here. But we also do highlight within our visitor center the tribal relations that we have here. We also provide ceremonial bison hunts for people that are within the Shoshone, Bannock, and Eastern Shoshone tribes. There are ways that you can include everybody. You just have to make sure that you have everybody that needs to be at the table be there. It is tough as somebody in visitor services that has to deal with a lot of different communities. Where you start is you get them at the table and you see what they want and what is their story and what do they want to be experienced by visitors.
Thank you, Annie. And I'm going to pass it off to Willem to close this out. And I'll be sure to track all the questions that are in the chat and send them to the panelists. so we can hopefully answer those questions for you all. Thank you so much.
Well, this was great. We reached the end of our webinar. We spent a full 1.5 hours, and I really hope you're leaving with new insights and ideas on how to build those meaningful relationships with local Native nations. And of course, a heartfelt thank to you, to our panelists and co-facilitators for sharing their knowledge and experiences. And like Natalie said, feel free to send in any questions you have and were not able to get answers to. Send it to Natalie or myself, and we make sure that answers get published on the COVA. Thank you all for joining us, and goodbye.